Hello, everyone. Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 78th episode of the Writ podcast. Ever since Pierre Poilievre became leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, you haven't seen too much of him in English language media. But if you've been in Quebec, you've probably seen quite a bit. The Conservatives are trying to woo Quebec, but what kind of challenges does Pierre Poilievre and the party have? Joining me to discuss it today is Marie Vastel, journalist with Le Devoir, and Philippe J. Fournier of 338canada.com. Marie, Philippe, thanks so much for joining me.
Bonjour, Eric.
Thanks for having us.
So, Philippe, why don't we start with you so you can set the stage for us? Obviously, you look at the numbers, you have your projections on your website. Where are the Conservatives right now in Quebec and what their prospects would be if there was an election right now?
Well, obviously, the projections has very little data to work with now because, of course, we had the Christmas break and the holiday break. But right now, the Conservatives are at around the same level they've been for, 15 years, even during the Harper era, between 16, 17, maybe the low 20s in some polls. But there's no massive conservative wave that we've seen. There's been no Poilievre effect in the polls in Quebec, at least so far. And the numbers that we had on Poilievre himself have been quite poor so far. So it's not as much as Quebecers do not know who Poilievre is what they've seen so far. They do not seem to enjoy much of it right now.
So, Marie, it does seem like Poilievre is trying to combat that. We've seen him on Radio-Canada. We've seen him on doing interviews in newspapers. It does seem to be the kind of access that is a bit more difficult to get on this side of the Ottawa River. So what approach have you seen from Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives when it comes to his own image and just how they're trying to set themselves up in Quebec for the next election?
I think they're trying very hard to turn that narrative or that impression. What I also find interesting in the polls that we've seen so far is the unfavorable opinions towards Pierre Poilievre. He's at 54% of unfavorables, according to an Angus Reid poll recently, but that's 63% in Quebec of people who see him unfavorably. It's the highest province. And I think that's where his challenge lies. You're right that they've been trying to be more accessible, do more interviews. I think the problem might be deeper than that, and we can delve on that later if you want, in terms of policy and his own team. But they're definitely trying to show him as, a smiling, sympathetic man. They really put his wife forward quite a lot. She's an immigrant and she's from Quebec. But then that sometimes clashes with his other public image, which is what he portrays on Twitter with his videos where he's very, very critical of the government, a little angry. And sometimes it's hard to reconcile those two images that he's trying to portray.
Marie, why do you think that we see him more on, the quote-unquote mainstream French language media than in English Canada? Is there a reason for the Conservatives to go that route in Quebec but not outside of Quebec?
I think he's probably less known in Quebec than in the rest of Canada. I don't know if pollsters have better numbers on his recognizability numbers, but I think he's not as well known. I think he probably does see a potential for Quebec. He's perfectly bilingual, the most bilingual leader they've had in a while. His wife, as I said, is from Quebec. I think he sees potential. It's just not translating so far anyways. Because of some of the Conservative Party traditional positions. You could think about gun control, the environment. Mr. Poilievre came back to the position of the party being against carbon pricing. You can think of immigration. Mr. Poilievre is in favor of increasing immigration numbers while the province of Quebec is trying to lower them. So the party is not in sync with Quebecers on these issues. And that might be where he's struggling to do better in the province. And he also doesn't really have any senior staff counseling him from Quebec, which is what other leaders had. They had senior advisors from Quebec. He doesn't, which also means there's no one inside to influence him or maybe encourage him to have a distinct offer for the province, which I don't think is what he is looking at doing right now, having a distinct offer for the province.
If I can jump in just for a second here, Eric, it's pure math. Right now, the polls show that the Conservative base is holding strong. And so Poilievre is not sinking the Conservative numbers, as some had said before during the leadership campaign. So where does he have to campaign to win? He has to campaign in Quebec and in suburban Ontario. The numbers that we have so far shows that, Conservatives are a bit up in Ontario, maybe not enough. But Quebec just voted for a CAQ government, which is a small C, conservative, right of center, traditionalist. And so Quebec is ripe for a conservative government. But the Quebecers voted for François Legault, not for Éric Duhaim's type of conservatives. So this is, I think, a major challenge for Poilievre to show that he's more of a moderate conservative.
Well, that brings up what I wanted to discuss, Philippe, with what's accessible for the Conservatives in Quebec, because he has been having to balance, some of the positions that brought him to the leadership of the party, which, are very, popular among the members, not popular among the general population, perhaps. And that is especially the case in Quebec. Quebec Conservatives, if you look at the MPs, tend to be a lot more moderate, right? So, Philippe, what is the kind of the ceiling for the Conservatives in Quebec? How low is that ceiling?
I would also ask Eric, if you don't mind, I would ask, what is the floor? Right now, we have 10 Conservative MPs. Well, 9 now because Alain Reyes is now an independent. But what is the ceiling? Monsieur Poilievre would increase dramatically his chances to become prime minister if you could get that number maybe to 18 or 20 or even 25 seats. I would look at the suburbs of Montreal. Those have voted massively for the CAQ in the provincial election and that voted for the Bloc Quebecois. I mean, it's something that is different for Poilievre because in Quebec, if you look at the demographics and the ridings that he has to win the election, Justin Trudeau is not his main opponent. It's the Bloc Quebecois. He has to win Bloc Quebecois seats if he wants to become prime minister. And so, of course, it's a radically different approach than in the rest of Canada.
Marie,
but it's not clear he's
ahead.
willing to court. Sorry, just to bounce off on what Philippe was saying. It's not clear that Mr. Poilievre is willing to court that nationalist vote, perhaps as much as his predecessors. And I think that's where he might be having trouble reconciling his ambition and what he's willing to say or do to get that nationalist vote on these policy positions that I mentioned. So far, he's saying that Quebecers have the same preoccupation as Canadians, suggesting he's not going to have a Quebec-specific platform, for example. It could change, but for now, that's what it looks like. And I think that him being pulled in both directions might also be within his team. Perhaps Mr. Poilievre sees possibilities in Quebec, but a lot of people in his leadership team in the House or people who backed him early on in the leadership race, some of those people think that they've courted Quebec long enough. It never gave him more seats. It didn't help them win government. And when Stephen Harper won government and a majority government, they only had 5 seats in Quebec. I'm hearing that a lot as well from people who would have the ear of Pierre Poilievre. So that might also be what is influencing his position.
I heard that argument very often since the new year that, Conservatives don't need Quebec. And I'm sorry, but that's such a ridiculous position. I mean, 2011, I think we can say with some hindsight that it was a complete fluke. Yes, if at the same time the Bloc Quebecois and the Liberals have historic lows, yes, the Conservatives can win without Quebec. But you can't bank on that every decade or so because it's most likely not going to happen. As I said, if he can double his Quebec caucus, suddenly he could really challenge for a strong minority or even a majority at the House of Commons.
But I think, Marie, you were kind of getting at that to go after those extra 10 seats in Quebec, does it limit the possibility for the Conservatives to do well in the rest of the country? When you heard, Jenny Byrne was someone, as you mentioned, who was with the Harper team when they won that majority. You've heard her criticize a lot of the positions that, Aaron O'Toole took, that he wasn't being conservative enough. Has Poilievre been consistent in keeping that message the same in English and French, which has not always been something that past leaders have been very successful at?
Yeah, actually he has, because so far he hasn't offered anything specific for Quebec. That might be his saving grace. So far he is saying the same thing in both languages. He hasn't done what others have done. And I think this current team really sees growth in Ontario and the GTA, where courting nationalists is not very popular. The other challenge for the Conservatives right now is Philippe mentioned in 2011 it was very specific circumstances. Right now, the leader of the Bloc Quebecois is quite popular. He's effective. He's good. They have a few messages that they really hit the nail on, and they're efficient in the House and in committees and publicly. So it's unclear how much growth room he would even have if he were to court that nationalist vote in Quebec.
Philippe, if he was able to do that, or, I mean, that's assuming that's the path forward for the Conservatives, right? To get to 15, maybe 20 seats, that seems to be the vote that they have to go after.
Yeah.
But then does that mean that if the Conservatives go up in Quebec, the only way that happens is if the Bloc comes down? Are they the ones that in most danger of Poilievre trying to make some inroads in Quebec?
That's a good question, Eric. There is a handful of seats, of Liberal seats in the rural regions of Quebec that are Liberal. But then again, those races were not against the Conservatives. They were against the Bloc Quebecois. And if I look at the Quebec map and try to spot, okay, where are the 20 seats? So you take the 10 seats that they won, mostly around the Quebec City area, Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, and a bit of the eastern townships. You look at the map and it's all Bloc seats. So perhaps they have to hope that there's a split vote. Maybe the Liberals do okay in Quebec and the Bloc Québécois goes down a little bit. It's always a challenge for the Bloc Québécois because, as Marie said, Yves-François Blanchet is popular. He's not breaking records like Duceppe was doing 15 years ago. But he got them to 33% of the vote and about a third of Quebec seats. That's respectable, and that's a problem for the Conservatives. They as I said, I doubt that the Conservatives can win 40 more seats in Ontario unless there's a major scandal with Liberals, which could happen. But they need to find 40 more seats, and if they don't increase their Quebec caucus, that 40-seat threshold, it's going to be really hard to reach.
Yeah, Marie, did you have something to add?
Well, I was just going to say the challenge also is, I feel it's always the same circle, but if you're not doing so well in the polls, you're not having that momentum, it's hard to get, experienced senior staff, to get maybe star candidates. That was raised during his visit in Quebec last week, whether he's trying to get star candidates or not. It's not necessarily the most appealing when you have no safe seats to give them. Saguenay area is an area where the Conservatives have done well in the past. But when you're at this level in the polls, it's hard to convince people to perhaps leave a provincial Quebec government to maybe be in opposition, maybe not even win your seat. Where they have maybe potential is that 6 of their 9 current MPs would be eligible to retire if they wanted to. And that could open up safe seats for star candidates. But that's, under the caveat that these people want to leave. If they see that they could maybe win government, I don't know if they would. And so that's also the sort of, I don't want to say vicious circle, but the circle where you're struggling in the polls, but you don't have any star candidates or staff, so you're still struggling in the poll. It's hard to break that cycle.
Although that could change if we see the Conservatives nationally increase to 36-37% of the vote. I mean, if the Conservatives are suddenly the hands-on favorite going into an election year, this could be a very good way to convince the star candidates.
Yeah, and one of the things that's kind of maybe surprising about those Conservative seats in Quebec is that a lot of them actually are, as you said, safe seats. They're not exactly very close ridings. There's a couple of them that were somewhat close last time, but a lot of them are won by big margins. So it's not that the Conservatives are at great risk of losing a lot of seats in Quebec. It's just very hard to find those extra ones. So if they had some MPs who decided that if the election, especially is in 2025, decide that's when they're going to step aside, because there were some that were elected in 2015, so it'll mark a decade that they were in office, that does open up some possibilities. But Marie, have there been any serious inroads in terms of recruitment? Would we see some CAQ MNAs make the jump to the Conservatives? Because we haven't really seen too much overlap between those two parties, aside from Gérard Deltel, but that's from like a decade ago.
Yeah, there isn't much overlap, and they're very careful to court CAQ people too openly, because they're very conscious that they have votes from every provincial party, from multiple provincial parties. The other thing is if these MPs decide to retire, that's not more seats, that's the same seats. It doesn't help them grow, to Philippe's point, and have a better chance at government. I think they could potentially, if they're seen as the favorites to win government, get some CAQ MNAs, I don't know if they could get really star CAQ ministers, because the CAQ also seems to be in a very comfortable position for the next little while in government. So why would you leave government to maybe win government? Some of them perhaps see themselves replacing Premier François Legault. It's a bit of a tough sell, because also the context in Quebec provincial politics is so particular that they seem to be pretty safe for a while.
Philippe, how does that overlap really work? Because, you're talking about a lot of the seats that the CAQ won last time, but there's a lot of overlap with the Bloc, right? So it's not exactly that the CAQ is a conservative party. That might be how it might be seen outside of Quebec, but it is a nationalist party, which is a mix of Bloc voters, conservatives, some liberals, some New Democrats. It's all over the place. So it's not anywhere close to what it is in some of the other provinces with blue team, a red team, and orange team.
That's true. Mm-hmm. But I would say, even some CAQ members would compare themselves to maybe a moderate PC government from the Maritimes, where they court the center basically. But as you said, very nationalist, which could be a problem for those who want to jump to the federal scene. But I have to go back to tone. Marie just said a few minutes ago that Poilievre hasn't said much different policies in Quebec and outside of Quebec. That's true. But his tone is very different. I mean, when he was in Quebec last week touring in the media, he did go on Radio-Canada, and he did go to Radio X in Quebec City, the far-right radio, that shock radio, as we would say. Even though he didn't say different things on policy, his tone was very different. And he has to, at some point, show Quebecers, again, does he want to be Éric Duhem conservatives, further right, and the attitude of the alt-right, or does he want to be, middle of the road? And so far, let's remember, François Legault had 41% of the vote, Éric Duhem had 13%. So you have to choose your lane at some point.
That's a good point, and I think that's also his challenge. He's been seen more as a Éric Duhem side of the conservative spectrum. He certainly courted people that way during the leadership. He seems to be repositioning himself, but to your point that the CAQ is a small C conservative government, it's a progressive conservative pool of voters and ideas. And let's remember that during the leadership race, Mr. Pollievre essentially erased progressive conservatives from the base of the party and beat Jean Charest, very, very strongly. And so I don't know if conservatives in Quebec, small C conservatives, CAQ conservatives, however you want to call them, see themselves, as of now anyway, in a Pierre Poilievre conservative federal government. I think they got the message more that it wasn't their party anymore. So he's going to have to convince them that they still have a place.
I think also just something that is a bit different in Quebec is that the provincial scene tends to be the A team often, right? If you want to get into politics in Quebec, you'll probably go provincial rather than federal. It's not like in Ontario or some other places where, at least in terms of that side of the equation, maybe if you're on the liberal side, the federal scene would be a lot more advantageous. I'd like to hear from both of you on this, though, because we're talking a lot about politics or the political spectrum. But let's just talk about language. In Quebec, there's a long history of preferring a party led by a Quebecer over a party that's not led by a Quebecer. Pollievre changes things a little bit because he, as Marie said, is the best-speaking French leader since Jean Charest. So that's, we're talking about a quarter of a century. But maybe Marie, we'll start with you, and Philippe, I'd also like to hear you on it. Can a non-Quebecer win in Quebec against Quebecers? He's got Justin Trudeau, he got Yves-François Blanchet. Can Pierre Poilievre be given the same platform, be given the same attention as those other two?
Yeah, I hear that a lot, and I'm sort of torn on it. I partly agree, I partly disagree. I partly disagree because one of those Quebec leaders currently is a Trudeau, which is really not a selling point in Quebec. So yes, he's from Quebec, but people hate him because of his name. I partly agree because that is what history has told us, that Quebecers vote with their hearts and vote for Quebecers. I'd add Jack Layton in there, wasn't prime minister, but Quebecers did like him. They call him the Bon Jack, and he was from Quebec, and he had a special offer for Quebec. But I don't think it's either or. I think being a Quebec leader helps you in Quebec, but I wouldn't discount the importance of your policies and your political ideas and positions. he could be a Quebecer and have some of the positions that his predecessors had, or some of the positions he had during the leadership race. I don't think he would be doing much better necessarily. So it could be an extra challenge for him, but I think there's deeper challenges with where the party is, where the party has repositioned itself during this most recent leadership race, this big reflection they've had on where they want to go, more progressive, conservative or not. I think there's that deeper issue there that surpasses whether he's a Quebecer or not.
Philippe, I'll let you go on that too. I just wonder if you get the same benefit of the doubt. Andrew Scheer, Aaron O'Toole, when they were kind of trying to get their position on abortion or gun rights, it's a lot harder, I find, in Quebec to be taken seriously than if it was someone who was from Quebec. They might be given the benefit of the doubt rather than seen as someone who was suspicious. But Philippe, what do you think on that whole issue?
It would be an interesting experiment to have, let's say, Monsieur Leblanc from New Brunswick try to run for the leadership of the Liberals. You have a non-Quebecer that's perfectly bilingual. It's true that, as Marie said, precedent says that if you don't speak an almost perfect Quebecois French, you can't win Quebec. But do two things on this. Jack Layton did it. He had some roots in Montreal, but he was a Toronto city councillor because he did make the effort of improving. We saw him on Tout le monde en parle, the popular talk show, every time he improves his French. And so, many Quebecers will forgive some mistakes if you show improvement. Andrew Scheer, the debate that he had in TVA, that first 5 minutes, it wasn't about abortion. He could not bring himself to explain his position in French, and he was completely baffled. And starting from that day in the polls, we saw him take a dive. So can Poilievre do it? He doesn't need to. He just needs to improve a little bit. He doesn't need to win Quebec like Mulroney did. He just needs to have, let's say, 25 to 28% of the vote. I mean, Harper in his first victory, I believe, had 25% of the Quebec vote. It did not yield too many seats because the Bloc was dominant back then. But, with 25% of the vote in Quebec, with a split vote, the Conservatives wouldn't win 15 to 20 seats. And suddenly, we're seriously talking about serious candidates to be a cabinet minister from Quebec in a Poilievre government. So he doesn't need to win Quebec. He just needs to do a little better.
Okay, so he just needs to do a little better. You said 15 to 20 seats.
Yeah.
I've seen some people say that 15, they've targeted 15 before. That's what they did in 2015. They were able to win 12 of them. Is 20 a realistic stretch goal? Because to me, 15 seems like one that, if they have a really good election, they can get to 15. I wonder, can they get more than that, Philippe?
More than 20? No. Right now, of course, things could change, and I know this clip will be recorded forever, so I have to be careful. But they could I could get the map and get them to 20 if they have a strong campaign. If he can, hold himself off against the Bloc Quebecois, François Blanchet in a debate, and if the Trudeau brand really goes down in the coming years, which at some point it will. It's still strong in Quebec, though, the Trudeau brand. I mean, Marie said his name is hated, among nationalists, but there's still half of, he's won the popular vote 3 times in a row in Quebec, and not many prime ministers in Canada have done this in recent history.
Oh, that's a good point. So we'll see. I mean, if they're winning 20 seats in Quebec, I think they're doing so well that they probably don't even need those extra seats anyway. But anyway, in a more realistic scenario where maybe they're winning a couple extra seats and they're getting up to 140, 150 seats in the House of Commons, we're in another minority government. Marie, can Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives govern in a minority situation with the Bloc? Is that an option for them?
I don't think it would be a set agreement like what we're seeing right now with the NDP and the Liberals. But I wouldn't exclude the possibility that on a case-by-case basis they can. There are things that both parties can agree on. We've seen it while they're in opposition. Sometimes they're aligned in their positions against the Liberals and the NDP. I don't know how long that would be sustainable, though. I'm pretty sure the Bloc would be very careful not to align themselves too much with the Conservatives because they're only in one province. They really only have one rival. They don't have to be as strategic as other parties who are pan-Canadian, right? So I think it could work, but I don't think it would be a very long government. And I think it would be a very unstable, short-lived minority government.
Just to continue on that, Marie, does Pierre Poilievre need to think about that when he's campaigning? Does he have to not... Does he have to go after the Bloc for votes or go after the Bloc for votes of MPs? in a minority government. Like, is there a balance there? Is that something even that he would have to think about?
Or is it both? If you're courting their voters, then presumably your positions could be susceptible to be backed by the party, right? I assume. I don't know if they would be thinking that far down the road. I'm pretty sure if they were campaigning and things were going well. Let's not exclude that we've never seen Poilievre campaign nationally. He's a very good debater. He's a very good communicator. So that's also a factor in our predictions of today that will probably be wrong in a year, as Philippe said. But I think that it would be interesting to see how he courts the nationalist vote, but not necessarily thinking that far down the road in terms of governing. I think, if anything, if he thinks things are going well, he's going to take that little coalition red card out of his pocket and tell us that he has to win a majority, because otherwise he'll be beaten at the first opportunity.
I'm going to finish on this. We've already talked a little bit about the influence from the Quebec scene, but Philippe, I'll go first with you, and then Marie. François Legault, we saw that he had an endorsement for Aaron O'Toole in the last election, more or less for Aaron O'Toole's for the Conservatives and the Bloc. Didn't seem to do anything for either the Conservatives or the Bloc. But he has been, sometimes a friend, sometimes an enemy for Justin Trudeau. For Pierre Poilievre, Philippe, is François Legault a friend or a foe?
That's a very good question. I don't think we know the answer to that. I think François Legault looks closely, as I said, the relation that we had between the Éric Duhaim's type of conservatism and usually what we see on the right side in Canada. But François Legault is very wary of that. Excuse me. He doesn't want to ally himself with a party that would be perceived as too extreme. So I could see, though, however, that François Legault needs to have a good relationship with the federal government, with the exception. Sometimes you want to go on Twitter and start, thumping your chest, because it's always good for any premier of any color to do that. If we see in the next year the Conservatives really take the lead and being the favorite to win the federal election, I would say that Mr. Legault might try to build bridges with that government, because it's just going to be advantageous. François Legault is a pragmatist. He says that, but it's not a slogan. He really is. So if he can find some des atomes crochus, as we say in French, he will try to find those.
Marie?
Yeah, and so far, even though I've been saying that Pollievre doesn't have a specific offer for Quebec, he hasn't said anything that's against what Quebec has been asking. Hasn't said much, but he's at least said he's open to most of their demands. And so I think there would definitely be room for that relationship to grow, like Philippe said. I think it goes both ways. I think if, like Philippe said, if Legault sees that Pollievre is doing well, he might want to start chatting more with him. And if Pollievre starts making overtures to Quebec and having more specific Quebec promises, then Legault might also be more receptive to that dialogue. But I definitely think they haven't met yet. It's not clear that they want to be best friends, but I definitely think both would be pragmatic and make the relationship workable, knowing that it has to be if Pollievre were to win government.
Actually, if I can just add this, Poilievre needs François Legault more than François Legault needs Pierre Poilievre. I mean, François Legault and the CQ are firmly in the driver's seat in the National Assembly. They're not going anywhere in the near future. So at some point, I believe that Poilievre will try to reach out to François Legault and not the opposite.
Well, we thought Aaron O'Toole needed François Legault, but I don't think in the end he really helped him all that much.
I mean, it could have been worse, maybe.
It could.
Yes, in the alternate universe, the Conservatives did even worse because Legault went out against them. Anyway, so this will be a long-term project, I think, for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, unless for some reason we find ourselves in an election soon. So this will be a story to watch for a little while. So I really appreciate both of you coming on, and we can chat about it. So thanks so much for coming.
Yes.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Eric.